this is sort of the time frame that we're talking about today, and as you can see, it's a long one, so we've got an awful lot to cover. This golden section here basically is the Roman occupation of Great Britain, and I don't want to stain this product people who see it over here. It's a pagan world. Christianity has really not come to England at this point. It's Roman occupation. It's early Christianity does come, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely. And then, along in the 400s, Celtic Christianity comes. The Celts migrated from Eastern Europe west into the British Isles and Ireland, and set up monasteries, and then evangelized back west. And it is said that the Celts actually saved Christianity, because once you get into the Middle Ages here, at the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity and the whole culture falls on pretty hard times. And then along around 600, you get Roman Catholicism, and you have this long 900-year period of Roman Catholicism in England, until you get to the 16th century of the Reformation, where we're going to spend most of our time today. And then in the 1600s, the Civil War, and then we move into more modern times, the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire. So that's sort of the time span that we're talking about. And if you look at that golden section a little more closely, on this side, we have things happening outside England. And on this side, things happening inside England. So we have the apostolic period when the apostles were still alive for the first century, and then this 200 years after that, where you had the likes of Alexandria and Tertullian and Origen and the church fathers that followed the apostles. And then everything changes in the early 300s when Constantine becomes emperor and says, okay, we're all Christian now. Because prior to that, Christianity was pretty much illegal. Toward the end of the 5th century, or 4th century, the Roman Empire collapses and the medieval period begins. In England at the same time, there's a legend, even in the 1st century, where Joseph of Arimathea, you remember, he was the one that donated his tomb for the burial of Jesus. Well, Joseph of Arimathea was a merchant, and he traveled as far as England. And if you visit Salisbury, you will see evidence still of the legend of Joseph of Arimathea actually coming to England. So that might be the first evidence of Christianity coming to England. In the 700s, the Venerable Bede writes the history of England for the first 700 years. And he writes in 209, Alban, missionaries came over to England, and Alban was converted to be a Christian. And his conversion was so powerful. And remember, Christianity is still illegal in the Roman Empire, but his conversion was powerful enough that the missionary that had converted him escaped because of Alban. The Roman authorities were after him. Alban protected him, and for his trouble, the Romans executed him. So he becomes the first English martyr in 209. And the Celtic Christianity, the Celtics were a monastic group. They would come in and they would set up a monastery, and then they would go out and convert whoever they could lay their hands on to Christianity. And you might remember Columba as one of those Celtic missionaries, and certainly, if not, you remember St. Patrick. And St. Patrick was actually a Briton. And he was the first. There were some before him that tried to convert the Irish to Christianity and failed. St. Patrick was able to succeed not only in converting some of the Irish, but the entire Ireland to Christianity. The Romans left England about 410. And when they did, while the Romans were there, they created stability. They brought their Roman culture, road building, and organization, and all that. And they, of course, they had their army. And they had been there since, by now, about 450 years. And no one would invade England while the Romans were there, because the Romans would crush them. But when the Romans left, that opened the door to Germanic tribes of Northern Europe to come in. And the Brits were already trading with them. So they actually invited them in to do more trading. And the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes looked around and they said, well, these guys are good for the taking. So they militarily invaded, and they came from what's now Denmark, the Angles and the Saxons here, and the Jutes. And the Angles took over this part of England, the Saxons this part, and the Jutes this part here, the strategic part, which is Kent, is where Canterbury is. And also they settled in the island right at the bottom there. So by 600, this is what England looked like. The Britons have been basically pushed to the western part of the country. The Angles took care of this part, Saxons down here, and the Jutes, these two little parts here. So that's a real thumbnail of that period of time. Then we get to the Roman Catholicism. Long about 600, Pope Gregory the Great, Gregorian chant. He sent Augustine. It's not Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine, who becomes known as Augustine of Canterbury. And he sends him to England to convert the Saxons to Christianity and to deal with the Celtic Christians that are already there. It's a little mismatch between what the Celtics are doing and what the Roman Church is doing. Gregory wants to normalize and have a common liturgy. He wants the whole of Christendom to be worshiping in the same way. 664, at the Synod of Whitby in northeastern England, it sort of came to a head between the Romans and the Celts. And the disagreement boiled down to who had the right calculation of the date of Easter. How do you figure out when Easter occurs? The Romans had a very biblical-based approach to answering that question, and the Celtics didn't. And the Romans, it was actually decided by King Alfred that he preferred the Romans to the Celts, so that gave the Romans their base. And Augustine was a Benedictine, and that started the building of many Benedictine monasteries, and eventually, over the years, other orders came in as well. But the Benedictines started it. The Vikings started invading once these monasteries were built. Not that that's what they were waiting for, but the Vikings started invading northern England, Scotland, even Ireland, and the whole west coast of Europe. And that took place all the way down to 1066, when William the Conqueror brought his army from northern France into England at the Battle of Hastings and defeated Harold, who was the king. Harold should have won. He had the high ground. He had a superior army, but Harold screwed up and lost. William then came in, and England is now eventually taken over by the Normans. And the Normans are really Vikings, Norsemen, that not only invaded but stayed. And we think of the Vikings as coming in, doing their raids, doing their killing and whatever, and then leaving. But they didn't always do that. And even in northern England, the Vikings actually stayed and became quite influential during that period of time. From the Norman invasion, that replaced the Anglo-Saxon kings with French kings. So this period of a couple of hundred years, England was ruled by French kings who not only didn't speak English, but for the most part weren't even in England. They ruled from France. Until the Plantagenets, and then you return to a time when the English kings were actually English, spoke English. And we get down here later on to Lancaster and York and the War of the Roses. And that brings us up to a period of time when the Reformation stage is set. So by the end of the 7th century, churches in Britain had become united to Rome via the Benedictine monasteries. And you could say, I mean, at the time, England was divided up with all these smaller kingdoms who were more or less constantly at war with each other, depending on who was strong and who was weak. And it's the church that really was the glue that held England together. So England, not even as a nation yet, was really united by the fact that the church was there, and the church created that stability across different kingdoms throughout England and Wales. (1215), the Magna Carta, Great Charter. That was the first attempt to define the rights of the common person, as opposed to the kings. So, what limited what the kings were able to do? And it turns out not very much for a long time. And it's not until we get into the 17th century that they start looking back and actually limiting what the king can do. And it's sad. It's sort of like when we look back to our Constitution and say, what can we do and what can't we do? That's the document that changed nothing when it was written, but became a benchmark to go back to hundreds of years later. The Lollards. Anybody remember the Lollards? Hear the name? Well, England had been inhabited by people, anthropologists and archaeologists say, for as much as 900,000 years. So, through that time, and we know it goes back a long ways because Stonehenge predates the pyramids, and the burial mounds that are in England predate Stonehenge. So people went through a Neolithic period, a Bronze Age, an Iron Age in England, and this created this underlying personality or character of the people in England. And that we see even today. So no matter who invaded or when they invaded, that had their influence, but there was this underlying character, personality that still prevailed. Layers on top of it, but it's still there. And we can even see it now with Brexit, for instance. But the Lollards, they were the first ones. I mean, we think the Reformation started in the 16th century. But the Lollards were actually the first ones to begin to question the Roman Catholic Church and why things were the way they were. And it goes back to this sense of British independence and their own personality that says, and remember that Christianity wasn't born in England, it came to England. So anything that came to England is ultimately suspect. So by the mid-16th century, you have 800 religious institutions, monasteries and friaries and nunneries and all kinds of things, plus 9,000 parishes, which is a 12th century number, so maybe even more than that. And you can see the influence that this would have on the whole culture of England. Let me back that up. That's the Canterbury Cathedral, and as we said, Augustine became known as Augustine of Canterbury. He was the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And I always thought that the Archbishop of Canterbury would live in Canterbury. Right? He was an Archbishop of York. He lived in York. Why would the Archbishop of Canterbury live in Canterbury? But since the 1300s, the Archbishop of Canterbury actually lived at Lambeth Palace. Lambeth Palace is on the south side of the Thames in London. Father David, where he also lived there before they came here. So, okay, now we're down to this interesting 16th century. And as a timeline, Martin Luther starts the Reformation in 1517, nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church. Henry VII is king. He's not a hereditary king. He's king because he's the guy that won the War of the Roses. And he's Henry, who's actually Welsh, but fought for the House of Lancaster. And he married, which really ended the War of the Roses, he married Margaret of York. But being a non-hereditary king, and the House of York still wanting their power back, Henry needed to shore himself up. He's the first Tudor. And we'll go through this, but we'll go through it in a different way. So 1509, Henry becomes king. Martin Luther does his thing, and Martin Luther didn't really intend to create the Reformation. His idea was, there's things about the Catholic Church that need to change. And he had 95 ideas how to change them. But he expected it would be changed within the church. But because Gutenberg, a century before, had invented the printing press, his ideas were published. And that sort of took it out of his control. And he wasn't the only one that thought that things needed to change in the Catholic Church. So it became more than he could handle. And it spread. And it spread to Germany, it spread to Switzerland, even in France, the Huguenots. Henry responded. Henry was an ambitious guy, and he even had ideas that he might want to be made the Holy Roman Emperor one day. So he writes a rejection of Luther's actions, and the Pope declares him a defender of the church. And Henry, through his whole life, saw himself as a good Catholic, even with the events that will come up. Now, Henry was not the heir apparent. Henry had an older brother whose name was Arthur. And Henry's father and mother thought it would be a great idea if they created an alliance with the superpower of the day, Spain, if their son Arthur could marry the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Elizabeth, who remembers that to discover America. So Catherine was their daughter, and this alliance. So Catherine moved from Spain to England to marry Arthur. Arthur died. And it's 7 years yet between
Pre or post? Pre or post? Pre or post marriage?
post,
Thank you.
but it's an important point. So, it's 7 years between the time Arthur dies and his father Henry dies, and Henry becomes Henry VIII king. And during that time, Catherine is sort of a persona non grata. She's there, she can't really go back to Spain as a widow. So she hangs out and develops this relationship with Henry somehow. And Henry, when his father dies, Henry becomes king and marries almost simultaneously. So that in his coronation, not only does he become king, but Catherine becomes queen. And in 1516, Mary is born. Catherine gave Henry 6 children. Mary's the only one that survives. And Mary wasn't a boy. And that's a problem. So Henry's in his mid-30s. He has no male heir. And Henry's ambition is to create this dynasty and lose a male heir. So he begins to seek an annulment, which should have been an easy thing to do. Henry's king of England, he petitions the Pope, and the Pope would ordinarily grant such a request. However, Catherine's cousin happens to be the Holy Roman Emperor. And she petitions her cousin on her behalf to talk to the Pope to prevent this annulment. This goes on for 5 years. After 5 years, the Archbishop of Canterbury died, and Henry appoints Thomas Cranmer to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Pope has been delaying and investigating and doing all sorts of things to prevent having to make a decision, because either he's going to offend Henry or he's going to offend the Holy Roman Emperor, and he doesn't want to do either one. So Henry takes things into his own hands. He appoints Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop. The Pope approves it to appease Henry, and Cranmer grants Henry not an annulment but a divorce. That's bad enough. But Henry immediately marries Anne Boleyn. This is a marriage that the church does not recognize. The church doesn't recognize a divorce either. And that starts the English Reformation. Anne is actually pregnant at her wedding, and Elizabeth is born the next year, which is a huge disappointment to Henry because Elizabeth is not a son. Now that Henry is separated from the church, he says, okay, I am now in charge of the Church of England. And Parliament at the time would do pretty much anything Henry wanted. And the Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which gave Henry the title Supreme Head of the Church of England. So now there's no separation of church and state. Henry looks around and he sees all these monasteries filled with all sorts of people who have pledged allegiance to the Pope. And Henry said, well, are you my subjects? Are you the Pope's subjects? So he requires everybody in England, every single person in England, to sign an oath of allegiance to him. And if you can't sign the oath of allegiance to Henry, that's treason. So, one or two, well, several things happened. Either you signed it, you ran away into exile, or you died. Those were your choices. 1536, Henry says we don't need all these monasteries. I can get all this land. The monasteries were really controlling the economy of all the towns in England. But Henry thought, well, we don't need them, and we'll get rid of them, which he did. And brought in other Protestant reforms. And you can imagine the influence of Protestantism in England, who was still trying to be its own Catholic Church in a way. Even Thomas Cranmer went to England to get a first-hand look at Luther and what he would, or went to Germany to get a first-hand look of what Luther was doing, and Cranmer himself became very Protestant leaning. In 1537, Anne's executed. Henry quickly marries Jane Seymour, and Jane gives him a son. Finally, Henry's happy, except Jane dies of complications the week after Edward's born. And it's about this time that Henry says, okay, enough with the Protestant reforms. We're done with that. Freeze everything as it is. And it stays that way till the end of his reign. Henry marries 3 more times, but there are no more children. And in 1547, Henry dies, and Edward, at the age of 9, becomes King of England. He's not old enough to really be king, so his uncle Edward Seymour is the regent. And Uncle Seymour is very Protestant. And the Protestant reforms, now that Henry is gone, can continue, and it's in 1549 when Thomas Cranmer produces the first book of Common Prayer, which he revises 3 years later. However, it's short-lived. 1553, Edward dies, and the people around Edward, being Protestant, want a Protestant successor. So they name Lady Jane Grey to be Edward's successor. She remains queen for all of 9 days. And elder daughter Mary becomes queen. Mary's very popular. Lady Jane Grey, not so much. And Mary returns England to the Catholic Church. And it's the same thing that happened with Henry, except in reverse. So now, if you're a Protestant, you either have to recant, you have to leave, or you have to die. And that's where Mary got her Mary, about 300 people were burned at the stake, including Thomas Cranmer. And her idea was, let's return to the church the way it was under Henry, in the last years of Henry. So these are not happy times. But Mary died in 1558. So Edward was king for maybe 5 years. Mary was queen for maybe 5 years. And then Elizabeth became queen. Elizabeth is Protestant and quickly reintroduces a new prayer book, which we'll see as a revision of the first two. And you have this pendulum swing back and forth between Catholic, Protestant, and Catholic, and back to Protestant. Imagine if you were a rank and file churchgoer, what that would have been like. Fortunately, Elizabeth reigned for a long time. She made her changes to the church very early in her reign. She was in her early 20s when she became queen. But she was around for 46 years, so period of stability. So she returned the country to Christianity, and rather than, every place else in Europe, it was you were either Catholic or you were Protestant. It was an either-or kind of a deal. Elizabeth said, well, maybe it should be a both and. Maybe we should take the best of the Roman Catholicism and the best of Protestantism and marry them together. So that's basically what she did, which stopped the more radical Protestant tendencies and, like I said, combined the first two prayer books into the third prayer book. So Protestantism in England now kind of at a standstill. And this is when the Church of England became known as the Via Media, or the middle way. So, Catholic and Reformed, we hold to the centrality of the councils and creeds that happened over the previous 1,500 years, rather than a confession of faith, which is what the other Protestant churches were doing. The Westminster Confession for the Presbyterians and Lutherans had their own, each one had their own, this is what we believe. We stuck with the creeds that were ancient, and further, we said we are united in prayer via the Book of Common Prayer. So, under the Via Media, we allow this spectrum of theology. And we can be both Protestant and Catholic at the same time. Which basically, at the time, pleased no one. Guiding principles, Matthew Parker, who was Elizabeth's Archbishop of Canterbury, he authored, or was the primary author of 39 articles of religion, which sort of defined that early Church of England. That was, in the end of the 19th century, reduced from 39 to 4 items, which stand today, and really were intended to be the basis of Christianity. No matter what our denomination was, this is what we agree on. And that is that the scriptures contain all things necessary for salvation. There are 2 sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. We hold to the Nicene and Apostles' Creed. And we hold to the apostolic succession, the laying on of hands for the historic threefold ministries of bishops, priests, and deacons. And if you want to check it out, there's a catechism in the back of the prayer book, which further explains or clarifies those things. We have some people to pay attention to in this early part of the church. Thomas Cranmer, which we've talked about several times. John Jewell, he developed the theological underpinnings for the Elizabethan settlement. And it was his work that really was the basis for argument against Roman Catholicism. Matthew Parker, we mentioned for the 39 Articles. And Richard Hooker, later in Elizabeth's reign, came up with the laws of ecclesiastical polity, and he coined the phrase that maybe you haven't heard of, the three-legged stool. Who's heard of I see some heads not making. Who's heard of the three-legged stool? Yeah, Scripture in Richard's thinking, reason. He said everything is not explained in Scripture. We have God-given reason to discern what is and isn't appropriate. And then in addition to that, we have the tradition of all of those who have gone before us, that we envision whispering in our ear about how to proceed. On the other hand, the other Protestant churches, it was Scripture only, sola scriptura, Scripture alone. That was their authority. And between the Protestants and the Catholics, Catholic authority rested in the Pope and the Curia. Protestant authority rested strictly in the Bible. That was the whole thing. It's not in the Bible, it doesn't matter. So Anglicanism expanded that to, along with the Via Media, to include reason and tradition also as influences. So now we're down to the 17th century. The Tudors included Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, had no heirs. She was the Virgin Queen. So the Tudor dynasty ended in 1603 when Elizabeth died, and the Stuart dynasty took over. Now, the Stuart dynasty at the time rested in Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots was Elizabeth's cousin, and you may remember Mary had her executed for treason. Reluctantly, but nevertheless.
Elizabeth had Mary executed.
Say again?
Elizabeth had Mary executed.
Elizabeth? Say again? I didn't hear you.
Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth had Mary, Queen of Scots executed.
Yes, she did. Mary, Queen of Scots, became Queen of Scotland when she was 9 days old. And she was basically queen her whole life until she abdicated when she got into trouble with Elizabeth. She really had a viable claim to the English throne. So when she abdicated, her son, James VI of Scotland, became King of Scotland. And when Elizabeth died, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And this is the first time that England and Scotland are ruled by one king. And of course, King James is famous for the authorized version of the Bible he produced. Not himself personally, but his son Charles I succeeded him. And this goes back toward the end of the Civil War. He is executed, kind of a kangaroo court, because it's really difficult to execute a monarch. Elizabeth did it with Mary under the most of duress. Charles was done almost, well, like I said, kangaroo court. It happened very quickly. But this, going back to the Magna Carta, it's this point in time, and during this period of time, the Puritans are gaining more and more power in Parliament. And they are saying, okay, the king's power is limited. We have our rights too, based on the Magna Carta. And that provokes the English Civil War. Charles being executed ends the monarchy in England for the time being. And Oliver Cromwell, a warrior, very Protestant leaning, he's named Lord Protector, and the Anglican Church becomes very Protestant. And it stays that way. But when Oliver dies, his son Richard takes over, but Richard is not Oliver. And Richard doesn't last but a couple of years. And the English say, we need our king back. We can't be England without a king. So 1660, the monarchy is restored under son Charles II, who fled to Holland when his father got into deep trouble. And under Charles, who was very Catholicly produced the 1662 version of the prayer book, which is still in use in England today, along with the various supplements to it. But 1662 is the Book of Common Prayer that is the basis for all the ones that succeeded it, including our own. The Protestant influence remains very strong until the 1830s, when the Tractarians in Oxford start the Oxford movement, and we'll talk about that more next time.